All right. So hello, everyone who is tuning in. Welcome to Community Table Talk. I am Danielle Phillips. I'm the Tenancy Liaison Specialist with the region. The topic of our segment today will be abuse and violence in the home. Our guest, our community expert is Bruce Moffat, who is the Executive Director of Victim Services of Waterloo Region. So thank you so much for joining, Bruce.
Thank you, Danielle. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's much appreciated. So like always, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement and say that the land on which I host this segment from today is the land traditionally used by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. I also acknowledge the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today. So Bruce, before we get in, I'm going to do just a quick disclaimer for anyone watching. Because our topic today will be abuse and violence in the home, that can contain some information that could be triggering or uncomfortable for some of the people watching. So I want people to kind of check in with themselves right now. And if you do feel uncomfortable listening to the whole segment, but you are interested in finding out resources or supports for folks who may be in this situation, please email myself directly and I can send those resources to you. My email is dphillips, Phillips, @regionofwaterloo.ca. All right, well, let's jump into it. So the first question to kind of open today, Bruce, is just what are some of the different types of abuse that people may experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. So off the hop, a lot of people tend to think of physical and sexual abuse that may be occurring in a home or outside of the home. But beyond that too, we can also see there's emotional abuse. So this being something that diminishes the dignity or self-worth of a person, provoking fear or inflicting psychological trauma on somebody. So that could be anything from yelling to threatening to intimidating a person. Beyond that, there can be coercive use of children. So we see this a lot where, whether it's threats of harming children or taking children away from their partner, using visitations as opportunities to harass their partner is another common theme that we've seen as well. Harassment and stalking, so any of the recurring unwanted behavior that, causing somebody to fear for their safety. And even as far as financial abuse and religious or spiritual cultural abuse. So any sort of tactic that is exerting control over somebody's religious orientation, their spirituality, or their beliefs would be other examples of abuse as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that kind of goes beyond the scope of what people kind of naturally associate with abuse. Like you said, a lot of people go right to the physical or sexual, and it's so much broader than that.
Definitely.
Yeah. Since our audience is primarily housing providers, this is a circumstance that they may find themselves where tenants could be in situations where they are being abused or abusing someone else in the home. What are some of the signs that housing providers may see that could indicate a tenant is experiencing abuse?
So there's always those physical signs. So whether any of the tenants or residents that they're speaking with have those bruises or physical injuries, they may be trying to cover up those injuries. Or there's some frequent or regular unexplained injuries that you're noticing on the tenants. Beyond that, it could be behavioral as well. So on the victim side of things, it could be acting nervous or cautious when their partner's around. They may be experiencing feelings or share that they're feeling isolated, afraid, withdrawn. They could be frequently apologizing or feeling they have to make excuses for their partner's behavior. Those are some indicators that there could be abuse happening in the home. And beyond that too, from the abusive partners side of things too, housing workers or community members, neighbors may notice that they tend to dominate conversations or do all the talking. They have that acting or feeling of superiority over their partner and that they bring more value to the home. Those could be some indicators that there's a power dynamic or some sort of abuse that could be happening in the home as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then, if a tenant is experiencing abuse in the home, how could that impact that person or that family's tenancy?
That's a very good question. So that is something that I would turn the question back to housing workers and say, and ask them the same question. A lot of times you're seeing maybe some repeated noise complaints or complaints against the unit for whether it's yelling, arguing, fighting going on. There could be frequent damage inside the unit, and this impacts not only the family or the people living in that unit, but the neighboring units as well. And as housing workers, if you're seeing these complaints and you're coming to issue those violations, it could be looking beyond the initial complaint or the issue at hand and saying, why is there so many frequent noise complaints, or why does it seem like there's holes in the wall frequently, things that are breaking, and if it could be signs that abuse is occurring in the home or as a result of some abuse and people taking frustration out on property, and unfortunately at times on people, then how does that in turn impact their tenancy, whether it leads to them being removed from the property? That can create some further vulnerabilities and putting people at risk as well. But yeah, for me, not being a housing worker myself, I would turn that question back to the workers too.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of a question that came up as you were talking, if a housing provider or worker feels like abuse may be occurring in the home, how should they approach that when talking to the tenants, or is there any kind of key points to keep in mind during that interaction?
Yeah, definitely. Keeping in mind that you may not know fully if there is abuse that is occurring, but you suspect it. It can be just offering support, having that supportive conversation saying, is there anything going on that you might want to share? I've noticed this and I have some concerns. I'd like to see if there's any ways that we can offer support or put you in touch with some supports. And I mean, more often than not, people would appreciate that even if there isn't abuse happening. It's, nice to know that people are looking out for them. Definitely too, if it gets to the point where there are disclosures of abuse being made, it's that initial reaction or response to those types of disclosures is so important. We want to make sure that people are feeling supported and believed. And while you're only getting sort of one perspective of the situation too, it's putting them in touch with those supports, whether it's through victim services or other community agencies. We tend to try not to push for, you have to leave right now, or you must go and report this to police right now, because that could put somebody at further risk of harm or abuse. So it's making sure that they have their needs met first, that they are supported, that they do have sort of that safety plan in place before making some of these more drastic changes that could put them at further risk. So as always, just being compassionate. All the workers have been great at having these discussions with their tenants, but they have that relationship already with them, or hopefully they have that relationship where just pointing out things that they've noticed and wanting to make sure that somebody is okay. They may not want to talk or provide information at that time, but as time goes on, if abuse is escalating, they may remember, okay, they showed some compassion or some empathy for me at that time. Maybe this is somebody I can go and reach out to now because I'm feeling stuck or I don't know where to turn now. So that can help down the road too when if abuse is occurring.
And I know a lot of us feel if that information is disclosed to us, we have that fear as well. And I think our initial reaction as an outsider looking in is, you need to go right now. Do you mind elaborating a little bit on when you had said that leaving immediately puts that person at risk for further harm or abuse? Do you mind just elaborating a little bit on that?
Yeah, so statistically in Canada and across the world too, some of the more dangerous, or when violence is at an all-time or increased risk, is when somebody is preparing to leave an abusive relationship or shortly after they do leave. So that is when somebody is more at risk of being victimized further. So for us, we want to make sure that they have that safety plan in place. Okay, if you're preparing to leave, here's some things to keep in mind or some things you may need. Making sure they have a safe place to go, making sure they have supports or connections so that they're not returning back to their abuser or kind of going back to that environment where things could escalate or continue on from where they were before.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense for sure. So we're talking a lot about when people leave, but there's also a perception that I've heard that, if someone is being abused, they should just leave. They should pack their things, make a plan, and go. But for a lot of folks, that's not the case. So do you
Right.
mind elaborating a little bit on why sometimes the victim of abuse doesn't leave the relationship?
Definitely. So that's a good point to bring up. And there's many different reasons why people may not leave an abusive relationship, but that can range anywhere from self-esteem. So if, abuse has been ongoing and repeated over a long period of time, they could have those feelings of, worthlessness, or like they're the problem or they're a cause of a lot of these problems. Feeling like they're incapable of being loved or loving someone else. So they stay in their current situation. Fear is definitely, a common element as well. So as I mentioned, violence tends to escalate when leaving an abusive relationship or if they try to leave. And so there's always that fear that, well, if I try to leave, things will get worse, or I can't leave because they'll just, cause more harm to them. And as always, it's important to remember that this is somebody that they're in a relationship with, and whether it is through marriage, common law, or any sort of relationship like that, there's a reason that they got together in the first place, and there are those emotional ties to their abuser. As we've seen, there's something called the cycle of violence, which I can show in a minute here. Anytime there's abuse or violence occurring, there's always, followed by apologies or something we call the honeymoon phase, where things sort of go back to being good in a sense. And I put that in quotes because it then leads to more tension building. And as arguments come up, things tend to escalate again. And abusers can be manipulative in saying all the things that, a victim may want to hear, that things are going to change or it won't happen again. And they start believing it until that cycle repeats itself. And as well, finances or financial considerations are important to remember as well. Everybody's situation is different, but they may rely on their abuser financially, especially if we're talking about housing too. A lot of times it's tough to leave an abusive relationship if you have nowhere to go. Pandemic aside, people may not have those supports or family locally or even within the province to be able to leave those situations. There may be kids involved too, and they don't want to disrupt sort of the family dynamic or put the kids at harm. So they ultimately end up staying. And then as well, if there's, as I mentioned, isolation or loneliness, they don't have that support system or somebody that they can have this conversation with to know, okay, if I do leave, there is somebody who believes me and will support me through this, and can get them to a place where they're able to move on from the abuse in the relationship. So I'd mentioned too, having sort of a visual or a diagram we can share. Do you mind if I put it here?
No, go for it.
Okay. So this is just one of our domestic violence fact sheets that we have available on our website under our resources section. So it talks about what domestic violence is, or as we refer to it now, intimate partner violence, the different types of abuse. So I mentioned here why victims stay. There's a section on that. And going down to the cycle of violence. So there's that honeymoon phase where either it's early on in the relationship or following an instance of abuse. There's apologies and things are going well. Until that tension starts building, and that can be through arguments, a single moment that sort of sets off a reaction from an abuser, or just falling back into that abusive cycle to the violent incident. And as we see, once that cycle completes itself, it can continue on going through that full cycle quicker and more rapidly, so that the abuse continues to escalate until it's ultimately it can end in harm or death to the individual. So important to remember that it is hard for people to break that cycle, and statistics have shown it takes upwards of 7 times or attempts to leave an abusive relationship before finally ending that cycle. So that's why going back to that initial reaction or response to disclosures is so important, because if somebody does return to the relationship or into that environment, they're going to still feel that stigma that, well, they're not going to believe me now because I've gone back, or they're just going to say it's my fault for going back. But if you still continue to respond with that empathy and that compassion, then at least they know that there is a place where they can turn to ultimately end that cycle.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, so these are available on our website in the resource section. There's also a large list of community resources available that we've posted links to as well.
Perfect. And I can download those and post them on the housing provider portal for any of the housing providers watching. Yeah. And I think you've touched on something so important, which is that education piece. You know, education builds empathy. And, you know, we see it over and over that if there are these stigmas or misconceptions around a topic, you know, how people react is going to be very, very different. So I think it's so important to have these resources available, especially for housing providers. You know, housing is such an important piece of recovery in any situation. And like you said, if we start noticing the signs and react with empathy, that can have a much different outcome. And I think if a housing provider gets to this point where they identify that someone, you know, might be in a situation where there's abuse occurring, they've disclosed abuse is occurring, and if the tenant or family is looking for support, what resources are available to them in this community?
Yeah, so Waterloo Region is fortunate to have a large number of community supports available, and this can range anywhere from the immediate sort of acute care type of response to counseling and to additional sort of follow-up supports in that aspect too. So victim services were available 24/7 to provide that crisis intervention support, whether it's an emotional support or practical assistance. I mentioned the safety planning too, that piece that's so important. We have a program called the Victim Quick Response Program, which we can apply for funding for any home safety considerations, changing locks, repairing or replacing broken doors and windows, transportation to safe accommodation, those basic necessities, anything to essentially remove any barriers from exiting an abusive relationship. In addition to that, Women's Crisis Services operates 2 shelters for women and children in the region. So there's Haven and Anselma House. They also have their outreach program too that can connect with women who are experiencing violence. Waterloo Regional Police has their intimate partner violence unit as well. We work closely with them and respond to any of those safety considerations that they may refer to us for a lock change, or somebody who doesn't have a cell phone but needs one to be able to call police. And beyond that too, family and children services, if somebody does suspect that there's abuse in the home and there's kids involved, I would encourage them to reach out to family and children services, who would be able to take that information and act accordingly if need be. And then beyond that too, there's a lot of counseling agencies, publicly funded counseling in the region too, that can help people through these types of difficult times.
Mm-hmm. And something that you touched on, when someone has experienced violence, especially in their own home, that must be such a terrifying experience. And, you know, there's been countless times working in housing where that situation has occurred and someone has changed the lock on their own, or has added deadbolts, or has added something to the door that violates their lease. So I think it's really, really great to have these services that, you know, because I in my experience working with you guys, you have accommodated those kind of safety precautions around the lease. So they're not going to be in trouble for using this service. You know, you guys will work within the parameters of what you're allowed to install. And I think that's such a great point, because we don't want to discourage people from making their home feel safe again, you know,
Right.
And at the same time, we also don't want them to get in trouble for doing that.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an important piece too, and a conversation we always have anytime it involves a rental unit that requires any repairs or changing of locks and things like that. We always advise the clients that we have to inform the landlords, just because, you know, we're essentially changing a piece of their property, and keys are involved too. They're going to need a copy of those keys as well. And your staff have been amazing at accommodating those needs. With our privacy and confidentiality and stuff with clients too, there isn't a lot that we can share, but the staff have been amazing at, when those requests do come through, making sure that either the in-house sort of maintenance staff can do those changes, is, or if it's a situation where we can have a locksmith come in and do that. It's done very quickly, and like you said, to get that place back to a feeling like a safe environment for that family.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the great partnerships here is that we're all working towards a common goal.
Mhm.
And regardless of what kind of position we're coming from, I think the underlying goal is always to support the tenant in whatever they need in that moment.
Yeah.
So is there anything else that we haven't touched on yet that you feel is important for people to know about violence or abuse in the home, or anything along those lines?
Yeah, no, we've covered a lot of information, and I know it's hard to sort of grasp a lot of these things at times too. But just going back to those types of responses and reactions to people, we may never know fully what's going on behind closed doors. A lot of times from the outside looking in, we see or hear those noise complaints. We hear things but don't quite know what's going on, and it's easy to make our own assumptions. But especially when it comes to intimate partner violence, it's looking beyond sort of the surface of what you're hearing or seeing, and thinking, okay, is there more going on there? How can I be supportive for that person? Who can I contact? So there's a lot of different services and resources in our community, and just reaching out on behalf of somebody or providing a phone number for somebody to reach out for their own type of support is huge, and makes a big difference for somebody, because the quicker they can get support, the quicker they have access to information, then ultimately the quicker that they can make those informed decisions to get themselves to a place of safety.
Absolutely. And I think it's sometimes people hold that opinion that it's not my business. Whatever happens there is your business, and whatever happens on this side is mine.
Yeah.
But I'm really excited to see that kind of culture change where, especially during the pandemic, I think this actually might be one of the benefits. I can imagine that intimate partner violence or abuse in the home has probably escalated when people are isolated together.
Yeah.
But neighbors care. They do. They really do care. And whether they're calling police, or whether they're calling your housing provider, or just checking in with that person, that's a big shift that I personally have seen over the course of the last year.
Absolutely. It's that sense of community, and that we're all in this together, and making sure that we support one another, and can provide that level of care for them.
Absolutely. And sometimes that just means we have to get to a place where we don't have a choice in order to build community. And I think that's where we are.
Yeah.
All right, Bruce. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. I imagine that your agency will probably get some referrals from this, which is wonderful. Do you happen to have the victim services number offhand?
Yes, I do. And thanks again for having me. I know it's great anytime we get to talk about raising the awareness around these types of issues, and sharing our information. So as I mentioned, we are available 24 hours. We can be reached by phone at 519-570-5143, or during office hours. Our office is available at 519-585-2363. And by email as well. It's at VSWR, for Victim Services of Waterloo Region, at wrps.on.ca.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again. And actually, one last thing that I have a question. Since you do have a WRPS email address,
yes,
does a victim need to have a police report in order to access services?
No, they do not. That's a great question. So we are a community-based program. We have a close working relationship with Waterloo Regional Police, and our offices are located at the 3 detachments in Kitchener, Cambridge, and Waterloo. But we are not employed by police, nor do people need to be involved or have police involvement to access our services.
Awesome. This is the wonderful thing about doing live recordings, is that you can just squeak questions in wherever. All right. Thank you again, Bruce. Take care.
Thanks, Danielle. You as well.